Hello and welcome to another in our series of lockdown live stream interviews with Glasgow Loves EU. And tonight we welcome John Purvis, who was the former Conservative MEP for Scotland, and we're very pleased to welcome him. Very last minute, so thank you, John, for finding the time to speak to us this evening. So John was born in St Andrews and went to St Andrews University, which we actually have in common because I was also there. So, and he then pursued a career. Oh, he had some time in national service in the army in the Scots Guards, and then pursued a career in financial services and banking. And then from 1979 to 1984 and 1999 to 2009, he has served as an MEP. So he's hopefully got lots of information for us about his experiences in the European Parliament for this evening. And more recently, he among many other things that he's been doing, he's been the chair of Fife for Europe, so one of our fellow European grassroots organisations. So we'll hear maybe about that as well. So just to start off, I noticed in your biography that you were elected in the two different periods that you were elected. It was under two different voting systems. So right. First past the post proportional representation. Do you feel that one worked better for representing the Scottish peoples?
Well, I think for representing properly in proportion, obviously proportional is much better, really. I mean, when I was elected in '79, would you believe it, that 5 out of the 8 MEPs were Conservative? And could that possibly represent Scotland? Anyway, by 10 years later, there were no Conservative MEPs, also after first past the post, which was not representative either. So I got in '79 in what was called Mid-Scotland and Fife, which had 7 Labour seats and 3 Conservative seats. And yet I managed to win that seat by a hair's breadth, but I got in. In '84, they changed the boundaries a bit, and of course I lost, so I was out. Mid-Scotland Fife was Labour until they went on to proportional representation in '99. And I thought to stand again then, and I was number 2 on the Conservative list, and we got 2 Conservatives, which is about proportionate, or was then. And I got re-elected in 2004, just again by the skin of my teeth. I was always skin of the teeth stuff, and, but that was appropriate. The other side of the coin, on the other hand, is I think with first past the post and representing this Mid-Scotland and Fife area, you were identified as the MEP for that area, whereas later, when it was proportional, you were one of 8, and then one of 7. And now actually, or latterly, it was one of 6, covering the whole of Scotland. And you always got this sort of saying, how do we know who our MEP is, you know? And it was a bit less immediate, the contact between MEP and the public. But it was lovely getting to know the whole of your country, working everything from Sullom Voe to Stranraer. And it was an amazing constituency to have to serve for 10 years.
And why did the numbers go down? Was that?
That was because of the enlargement of Europe, of the European Union. They had been allowing the number of MEPs just to increase as new countries joined. And then they began to run out of space in the buildings. You know, they could you accommodate any more? So they put a limit of 7, actually, sort of notionally 750, but actually it was about 7, just a bit less, 730 something. And when the big group joined in 2004, it went down to 7. That was all the East European countries plus Cyprus and I think Malta, was it? And then in '09, when Bulgaria and Romania joined, that brought us down another notch to 6 for Scotland. Of course, Scotland is relatively underrepresented as part of the UK. The UK has 75 members, or did have. I think Germany had the most at 81. We had 75 with France and Italy. And then it went down, except that no country had less than 6. So Malta had 6. and it's only a few 100,000 people. Scotland had 5 million odd people and had 6 because it was part of the UK.
All right, interesting.
That's how I work.
Yeah, yeah. So just moving on, I believe you were quite involved in setting up the single market, which was, I think, was that the internal market initially and then became known as the single market?
Yes, yeah. Well, when I joined the Parliament, I went on 2 committees, and actually the 2 I've been on all the way through, really. One was, in those days, was called energy. It was really basically energy, because energy was the big issue, but it was actually energy industry and trade and research, and it included a subcommittee on the internal market, which was pretty minimal at the time. In fact, we used to spend our time with huge, great dossiers to standardize things, to harmonize things that were going to be traded across Europe. And we'd get these great big dossiers. I remember one was on the pedals on forklift trucks, because some countries had them on the left and some had them on the right, and we had to get them standardized so that you could sell a forklift truck across Europe. And then the next one was the fur on teddy bears, which was not harmonized. And when I saw that, I must say, I said to my colleagues, this is ridiculous. How can we possibly waste all our time discussing teddy bear fur? Let's do something to stop this system of every single item being harmonized, set a date, and anything that's not harmonized by then, it's free to move around Europe. And that's essentially what became the Single European Act. We set up a thing called the Kangaroo Group in Parliament. There was a British colleague of mine, was an ex-MEP called Basil de Ferranti, and he was a great pal of Mrs. Thatcher's. And if you remember, I don't know, you won't because you were all hardly born at the time, but Mrs. Thatcher was having a great battle with Europe about her budget contributions. And this was going on and on. It was very tedious and unpleasant and difficult. And so we suggested, or Bos Ferranti did, why don't you get something about the single market, which would be really good for Britain, and in exchange for them giving you some money on the budget. And that's what happened at a summit in Milan. And it became the Single European Act in 1985. And then there was a commissioner appointed, British commissioner, who was put in charge of doing the single market. And 1992 was set as the deadline, when if it hadn't been harmonized by then anything could move freely around Europe. And that happened. And so that's why we had the single market. I think the European Parliament and actually the British MEPs had a lot to do with it. We had a lot to do with airlines, getting the freedom of the air, which you now have with Ryanair and EasyJet and all these things. That was Lord Bethell, Nicholas Bethell, who was a Conservative MEP in our group, who pushed for that very hard. We had several colleagues on the Transport Committee who also pushed for that, but also for road transport. Road transport was a real problem. To get a truck from Scotland to Milan took nearly 2 weeks because of all the papers and bureaucracy that had to be dealt with to get it through the border posts. And we got it down to 2 days by the end of the time. And that's going to be reversed, of course, on the 31st of December, when these trucks will all be sitting in great lines at the borders, trying to get through again, filling in forms.
Yeah.
And we'll be back to square one.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm always a bit confused with the single market and the customs union on the trucks movement. Is that, you think then quite a lot of it's to do with the single market?
No, it's all single market, essentially, internal or single market, whatever you call it. It all comes to the same thing. Free movement was part of it. Even actually, the currency is part of it when it comes down to it, because actually the ultimate way of protecting your trade is to let your currency devalue, which makes it more difficult for people to sell goods into your market and easier for you to sell it into theirs. So competitive devaluation of your currency was a system that countries did use to get advantage in trade. And that's where the euro came from, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. So you were an advocate of the euro.
Very much so. I did the report on the euro in 1983, would you believe it, which decided on the charter of the central bank and also had something to do with the sign for the, what then was the ECU, is now the euro, being the Greek epsilon, which is now the symbol for the euro. That happened also in 1983.
Right, okay. And was the euro not, my limited knowledge of finance, was it not more of an advantage for sort of the countries like Germany and less of an advantage for places like Greece? Did it not make like Greece's produces
well, actually,
more expensive?
our big issue in 1983 was the Germans, because the Germans had the Deutschmark and they were very proud of their Deutschmark, and they didn't want to end up with a rubbish currency that would be devalued all the time. And that's why the charter, and in fact it was in this report in 1983, the charter of the central bank would be for one thing only, and that was to maintain the value of the currency. Now, yes, that is tough on countries that don't discipline their currencies very well, and who have a easygoing or just a poorer, it is more difficult for poor countries. And in fact, the whole system for entering the euro was a thing called the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism. And you had to join this first and work in that for a year or two or more until you had stabilized your currency vis-a-vis the others. And of course, Britain went into the ERM under Thatcher's prime ministership, but then came out under John Major's prime ministership, because we didn't devalue to adjust. We tried to be very proud and said, oh no, we won't adjust our currency, we'll put up the interest rates. And of course, Mr. Soros in New York made a packet and went out of it, and that rather stopped. But it did actually, in Britain's case, stop the inflation that we've been having in the economy, and brought us down to a very stable economy in the 1990s. From a financial point of view, at least.
Yeah. Okay, and so moving on, you were also on committees on industry, research, energy, and I see biotechnology as well mentioned. So
I went on the energy committee originally because, of course, in 1979, energy was a very big issue. We had all this thing about, you might remember again, petrodollars and all this stuff. There was great crisis. The oil prices had risen up, and Scotland, of course, was just beginning to get an oil industry in the North Sea at the same time. So energy was seen as a very big part of our economy, very important. So I went on that committee. But we also did do quite a lot of industry as well, and because it was industry as well as energy, and research, which was a big item, the research budget. And so biotechnology, I was just asked to be the rapporteur on an own initiative report on biotechnology, which I took up and I got very interested in. And I think we became quite set a standard for the biotechnology industry throughout Europe, and set it moving.
Yeah, because obviously been quite a divisive area, and
well, yeah, it's divisive in some areas, what GMOs you're thinking about and so on. Actually, Scotland was one of the most advanced countries on research in genetically modified crops. At Invergary and near Dundee, the Crop Research Institute, as it then was genetically modifying, would you believe it, tobacco plants as a cancer cure. So genetically modified tobacco plants had to be actually, because we came down against GMs in the end, was exported to America, and they took on the research in that area.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And, there are positives about genetically modified things. For example, crops that can grow in very arid areas that couldn't otherwise grow there, provide sustenance and food in disadvantaged parts of the world. So there are lots of advantages for it. It's just a matter of, the big issue with the Americans at the moment, or the trade issue, is if we don't allow it for our own farmers, but we do import stuff that has been grown that way, that's an unfair trading issue.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not that necessarily GMs can't be used if they're used sensibly in the right places.
Yeah. Just need to know about it. Yeah.
Yes.
I know it's a fascinating area, and there's new research all the time in that area. Yeah. And so what else? Just jumping on, I think you mentioned the recovery plan that the EU had last week.
Oh yeah.
You thought that was quite significant.
Yes. Well, all the time it's almost the same as America in the 1860s. States' rights and all this thing about the difference between the overall community and the individual countries' rights and so on. The one thing that I think Europe was lacking was a sort of system of solidarity, whereas the richer parts help the poorer parts, or the parts that were having problems, even temporary problems, could be helped by other bits that weren't having temporary problems. A bit more solidarity. There was a certain amount of this, but with a budget which was restricted to 1% of the GDP of Europe, very small relatively, and was all dependent on cash coming from each individual country in budget transfers. There was no ability for the European community or union as such to raise funds on the markets. It meant there was a limited resource. And I think this was the big test, which actually, funnily enough, I think the Brexiteers were all looking at with relish, that Europe was going to fail, and this was going to be the beginning of the disintegration of Europe, because in fact, they came through after a struggle, but after 4 days of conference, that's all. It's taken us months to get Brexit sorted out, years to get Brexit sorted out. So after 4 days, they managed to get an agreement where there is an ability to work on a sort of mutualized system of budget transfers and fund transfers, so that when countries have genuine problems, you help them out. It doesn't deny that there will be discipline if they're not having genuine problems, if they're due to profligate spending or poor management. Then you have to keep the discipline going. But when there's genuine problems, like the immigration problem in the southern countries, Spain, Italy, and France, or disease problems like in Lombardy or wherever, then you help, and that's part of, I think, the European concept. It's also, I think, a moral and ethical concept for the world at large. I think selfishness is one of the things that's beginning to raise its ugly head rather much in Europe and in the world at the moment.
Mm-hmm. I know. I remember reading was it Ted Heath did the North-South report? Yeah. And I mean, even just from even from a selfish point of view, it makes sense to make sure other countries are operating well, and you can support them so that you can then trade with them, and things like that. But,
well, yes, you're dead right. I mean, if you have poverty-stricken countries in Africa, the people are, anybody with any get up and go is going to get up and go and end up crossing the Mediterranean to get into the honeypot that is Europe, or get up from Central America and go into the United States. So it's actually purely selfish motives. It's in your interest to keep standard of living and relative standard of living good in those countries. And actually, Europe has a pretty good history. I don't know if you're conscious of, there's a thing called the African, Caribbean, and Pacific organization. It even has a little parliament, which is made up of one member from each of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, all these countries around the Caribbean, the Pacific Islands, African countries, and one member of the European Parliament for each country, representing each country. And they meet in a parliament which has advisory powers to advise on how aid and trade is worked between Europe and these countries. It's probably one of the most liberal, open ways of dealing with relationships. It's not just us giving to them, it's we're working together to get the best sort of deal. Don't say it's perfect, but it certainly is an attempt to.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, good. I've got a funny feeling our question system has failed. Is that right? I think Paul has
flummoxed them all. Well,
Paul's frozen, and we have no way of bringing in our questions. So sorry if people are.
There's no questions yet.
Oh, there's no questions.
There's no questions.
Oh, well, you must have had all the right answers so far.
Yeah.
You mentioned I've involved setting up Fife for Europe, which we set up really rather like you set up Glasgow Loves Europe and Stirling and Perth and whatever. And I think it is awfully important that we at our grassroots do work at this. And in Fife, it's become almost a bit more than just a purely political thing. It's become almost a human mission. We've now got a lot, and I think you have too in Glasgow, this issue about European citizens and their rights and to live as in this country, having lived here for years in many cases, and now being treated in a shameful manner in the process for getting either settled status or citizenship. And I gather, you know, we've been campaigning on this now for a while, and it's beginning to get a bit of head of steam, I hope. And I hope we can do justice to these people who've done a wonderful service to our country and also are just wonderful people. And yeah. I think one of the great sadnesses to me is the freedom of movement, the loss of that, which is, you know, this was all a result of so-called the immigration issue that came up during the referendum was just completely fallacious about the Turkish influx and all that stuff. But I mean, and actually we had our passport controls in this country anyway, so there wasn't even the ones that did get into the rest of Europe couldn't get in here without having to pass passport controls. But quite apart from that, there is this essence that it's actually a great thing for our people to be able to move around Europe freely, for our young people to be able to go to university anywhere, to get a job anywhere, to go and see their friends anywhere, to marry anywhere. Heavens, I married outside my country. And I think if we did it now, she wouldn't be allowed in.
Yeah.
Yes, we'd have to live in where?
I hate to think. Where did she come from?
She came from America.
Oh, America, right?
Yeah, but I mean, it's you know, now it's not so easy for that if you marry an American or a Frenchman or let alone a Russian or whatever. For them to come in here, and it's sad.
Yeah, and Europe's so close to us. It's just crazy shutting off that route for young people. Yeah. So I've got an interesting question here. I'm imagining you've followed the whole campaign in detail, the way the rest of us have. But what have been the sort of standout moments where you maybe felt we had a chance to reverse things, and some of the great heroes of the sort of pro-EU side have actually been the sort of pro-European Conservatives, certainly.
Yes.
What would you say were some of the people and moments? Yeah,
well, of course, in 1979, when I was first elected and we first started the European Parliament on a directly elected basis, the Conservatives were the strongly pro-European party. We were the party afterwards. Edward Heath had got us in there. Mrs. Thatcher had campaigned vociferously to get into Europe. And when we went to Europe, to the Parliament, those first years, we were the very strongly pro-European party. I don't know, then there was our great problem was trying to get any true representation of how Europe worked, what it did, and how the Parliament worked, how democratic it was, and all this sort of thing. And the media was a big problem. There was no representation of what was happening in the European Parliament or in Europe for that, except negative things. The only thing that could get any attention was Boris Johnson pontificating about bent bananas or something like that, you know, stupid thing. So we lost traction over the years. And I think there was a willingness on the part of our governments, successive governments, although some were better than others, and certainly of MPs and civil servants to some extent, who saw their power and their influence and their rep being sort of minimized or diminished by this juggernaut over the channel in Europe taking over. In fact, so it was denigrated as being undemocratic. Well, actually, Europe was much more democratic. No trade deal now could get through the European thing without the European Parliament and every MEP having a say and a vote about it. Looks like if we do trade deals with the US, or anyone else for that matter, they go through without any even scrutiny by the British Parliament. They're just stamped by 10 Downing Street, and that's it. So there's a and this hasn't got across. This hasn't got across. There were some people who go back to my early generation, I suppose, the John Majors and the Dominic Greaves, and these are people who recall, what the real issues were and where it came from, and who still stood up for it. But I'm afraid we've been bypassed where the oldies. I think we'll come back. I think you lot, Jenny, you or your generation, will bring it back, because it really is an amazing construct. And the campaign, I'm afraid, was all done on the basis of what's in it for us in terms of pounds, shillings and pence, or pounds and euros, and really not the overall concepts of peace, of democracy and freedom, of looking after the world and making the world a better place, all these big, huge issues. And peace. I mean, I actually am just old enough to have lived through the Second World War. And I actually ended up in Hamburg in 1946, as my father was posted there after the war. And I saw the destruction of Europe and the destruction of Hamburg in Germany. And not to mention, actually, just having no father for 8 or 9 years until I was 8 years old. I never really saw my father because of the war. So, I mean, that was the life that we came away from, and what we really made a huge difference to. And I'm awfully afraid we risk going backwards. I hope not that far, but who knows?
I know. Yeah, I don't know how it's.
Talking about here, I mean, there were, as your questioner suggests, several very brave Conservative MPs who did stand up for what they saw during that period of the latter part of last year, and they sacrificed their careers and not their reputations. Their reputations are intact, and they will remain intact, I'm sure. In fact, if anything, it'll be the other lot who will end up with a tarnished image once people begin to realise just what we've lost and given up.
I know. Yeah, there seems to be a major attack on democracy, doesn't there? And it's supposed to be taking back control, but anything.
Well, I think it's taking back control by a small oligarchy.
Yeah.
not by the demos.
Yeah. Oh, and Paul, did any more points come through? Any? Oh, there's a question, I think, is there?
Well, I have a question from Dee, which you've kind of partly answered, really, I guess, which is really about how you view, given the history of the Conservative Party and our place in Europe, which you've just talked about very eloquently, what your view is on current government handling of Brexit as we head towards the end of the transition period and possibly no deal. And relatedly, what can you or anybody in the Conservative Party as a pro-EU person do to exert pressure on government policy?
Yeah, well, we've tried. I think it looks to me like the thing is going to unravel. Maybe wishful thinking, but there are no trade deals of any worth coming through, other than possibly a European deal if they go back on some of their red lines. But I mean, the American, when Johnson was up in Orkney the other day, he was asked about the trade deal. I saw him on television. He was saying, "Oh, they're being awfully difficult. They won't let us sell char baths to the American Army. Procurement rules don't allow anybody other than American products to be used by the American forces." Or there was some other problem that we know about. The insurance. Insurance is difficult because every state has a different insurance regulator and all this sort of thing. So clearly, and he's actually, I think, admitted now that the American deal is not going to be done by the end of the year, certainly, and probably not for a long time after it. And also, a lot depends on whether Mr. Trump, his friend Mr. Trump, gets back in as well. So that doesn't look awfully likely at the moment. So I think that's probably gonna. There are I think it's 50 or 60 trade deals that the EU has with other parts of the world, all of which have to be transferred to deals with Britain. And why should any of those groups actually make a better deal with Britain than they have with the EU, or we have already through the EU? So we're not going to make anything. So there's a lot of downside. Now, okay, they say, oh, we'll camouflage the Brexit downside by the COVID disaster that's going to hit us at the end of the year. Well, I don't think they can. I think it's going to be pretty obvious when trucks are all stuck at Ashford in a big field that they still haven't got around to clearing out. When this is surely it's height of irresponsibility to load the country with the Brexit exit on top of the COVID thing. Now, okay, he has a majority of 80 and a lot of nodding heads around, and but there's a beginning to be a reaction. I distinctly feel it happening, and I think between now and the end of the year, it's quite possible that we'll have to see some sort of mini revolution of some sort. But maybe that's what it'll have to be. But I think even in the Conservative Party, there's a growing disenchantment with the way things are being managed and going. A lot of the people of my sort, I suppose, who are now mostly outside, but there are some still within, are maybe keeping their counsel, but they'll get there in the end. I think there's a lot to go for. And I think the Labour Party now although they're 80 seats behind, they've got a much more responsible approach to things, I think, than they had. And that will help. The Scottish issue, of course, is a major one. But now I don't know whether they don't dare to stray into SNP politics, because what they're going to be doing between now and next May. But the Scottish issue is obviously beginning to rankle a lot with the government and what it's doing. So I think Scotland has a part to play. And I think all our efforts in these grassroots areas in making it clear to the people of Scotland, or at least translating what the people of Scotland already feel to the rest of the country about the Brexit issue alongside, everything else, I think is important. That's why keeping the Brexit flame going in Scotland is so important. And I think that'll migrate across the border southwards gradually once the people begin to see what the real outcome is going to be, unless they get a really good trade deal with Europe. And that means a lot of egg on face, I think.
Good. I know. Oh, well, yeah, it's interesting times anyway, isn't it?
Well,
yeah.
I'm not sure we want an interesting time, the Chinese say, but
I know. Yeah, every single day has been more interesting than the previous 4 years. It's like, oh, we can't cope anymore. So, that was an interesting discussion this evening. Lots to think about. And next week we're actually talking to a journalist from the Scottish Farmer magazine, and I see you have farming interest. Do you still have a family farm? Or something?
Yeah. My son is responsible for it now.
All right. Yeah.
We have a farm here in East Fife, and it's
lovely.
It's an arable farm, which is possibly a bit less exposed than the livestock farms, and livestock farming in Scotland could be terribly exposed if we end up with a bad deal with America and no deal with Europe. Appalling. Where are we going to sell that lamb and things? And actually, the fishing industry, much as we keep on talking about how fishing is anti-European or something, but in fact, where are we going to sell all that fish that's going to come on, that is processed in the northeast, or it comes in the west coast from all the lobsters and shellfish that require and demand a next day delivery in Paris.
Yeah, yeah, they can't be sitting in Kent, all the lambs and the fish. Yeah,
the fishing and farming is very exposed, and I don't think
yeah.
it's beginning to come home on that front as well.
Yeah. Oh well. Well, thank you so much for talking to us, and hopefully we'll see you at some future.
Couldn't excite any questions, but anyway, I enjoyed it.
Well, no, we had a few there at the end. So. But that was great to talk to you, and hopefully meet up at some European Movement march or something.
I'm sure we will.
Great. Yeah.
Thanks,
okay. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Good night to everybody watching.